1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock.
The period immediately following World War II set the stage for the development of the Australian cultural identity for the next 70 years. The values, attitudes and way of life that developed during the 1940s and early 1950s would go on to form the basis of people's understanding of what it meant to be Australian. The relatively wealthy generation of youth that became known as the baby boomers defined this period, and the term teenager became used widely to describe people who are somewhere between the age of children and adults. Emerging consumerism was fueled by the desire to follow trends in music and fashion from around the world. The late 1940s and early 1950s were part of the golden era of radio in Australia. Television had not yet been introduced, so radio was the main form of home entertainment that became an important outlet for popular culture. In 1955, 97% of households had at least one radio that the family would gather around to listen to the daily news, music and popular game shows. Although the spoken content was uniquely Australian, most music from this era came from Britain and the United States of America. Black and white television became available in Australia in 1956. The first program, a news broadcast, went to air 2 months before the Olympics began in Melbourne. Interestingly, it was read by an American. The US presence on Australian television from the outset was an indication of the impact that US would have not only on Australian television, but in shaping Australian culture, including music, in the future. Radio was quickly surpassed as people's favourite form of entertainment and adjusted its program to mainly music. Rock and roll music burst onto the cultural landscape in Australia in 1955 with the release of the film Blackboard Jungle, which featured the hit song Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets. Although not the first song that could be called rock and roll, it signalled a significant shift in the type of music and performer the young baby boomer generation was interested in. With simple, repetitive and often suggestive lyrics sung by performers with unconventional clothing, hairstyles and dance moves, rock and roll was condemned by the older generation as offensive and sexually suggestive. Nevertheless, it defined popular culture during the 1950s and 1960s. The combination of radio, film and television ensured that the influence of rock and roll spread rapidly, and the arrival on the music scene of the young Elvis Presley in 1956 ensured its popularity with both female and males. Australian performers embraced rock and roll and many local stars emerged. The most well known was Johnny O'Keefe, who shot to stardom as a support act for Bill Haley and his Comets on the tour in 1957. O'Keefe later went on to host a television program called 6 O'Clock Rock. This, along with Brian Henderson's Bandstand, promoted many Australian musical performers. In the more traditional world of Australian music, composers such as Dulcie Holland, John Anthill and Robert Hughes were composing works in the neo-romantic and neo-classical style, with experimentation in orchestral colour, as was prominent in other composers working in Europe and America. Improvements in transportation options during the 1950s and 60s had a profound impact on the Australian way of life. By 1951, hundreds of cars were being produced by General Motors Holden, and by 1962, 1 million Holdens were on the road. The ease of throwing a surfboard on the roof racks of the car to head to the closest beach was reinforced through popular culture from the US, such as the music from the Beach Boys and movies such as Gidget. Surfing became a key aspect of the Australian way of life. It was this availability of motor vehicles that gave this generation much greater freedom and independence. Surf culture had its own brand of music, which Californian group The Beach Boys are most famous example. It is not surprising that with the existence of surf culture in Australia, homegrown surf artists such as the Atlantics topped the charts in 1963 with their instrumental song Bombora. Qantas started its around the world service that extended the boundaries of possibility beyond Australian shores for many artists. Many not only took Australian behaviours and values to the rest of the world, but furthered the development of Australian culture by the ideas and knowledge that they brought back. Rock music had become sanitised for a mass audience by the early 1960s, with musicians carefully chosen and groomed to perform songs written for them. The US influence was still quite strong, but in 1963, an English group called the Beatles had their first hit in the United States. From Me to You signalled the beginning of the British bands having an influence on popular culture during this period. It was not long before Beatlemania swept Australia, as well as their songs dominating the music charts, and the subsequent tour in 1964 led to wild scenes of screaming and fainting girls, desperate to get a glimpse of the performance. The Beatles opened up the way for another British band, the Rolling Stones, to make their mark in Australia also. Australian groups like the Easy Beats and Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs created music in a similar style to these British bands and enjoyed considerable success. Folk music became very popular during the 1960s, with performers such as Bob Dylan and the group Peter, Paul and Mary writing songs that seemed to reject mainstream popular culture and attempted to deliver a message to their audiences. The Seekers were an Australian band in this genre that became very popular worldwide. This style of music gave rise to the hippie movement, which originated in the late 1960s and 1970s. In classical and experimental music, the 1960s saw increased interest in how electronic music could solve both compositional and more practical problems. Composers were absorbing ideas from overseas, such as interdeterminacy and electroacoustic music, and interpreting them in an Australian context to mixed response from local audiences. Graphic scores and aspects of surrealism in jazz improvisation experienced a real rise in this era. There was a new confidence in composition. The ABC increased its commissioning of new works for orchestra to be broadcast, new tertiary music schools were founded across the country, and the almost completed Opera House loomed as the symbol of the future. The 1960s ended with songs of protest and the psychedelic movement of performers such as The Doors and Jimi Hendrix. The Woodstock Music Festival in 1969 was the pinnacle of youth culture in the United States, and Australia followed suit with the Pilgrimage of Pop on the New South Wales Central Coast in 1970, the Meadows Technicolor Fair in South Australia in 1972, and from 1972 to 1975 the Sunbury Pop Festival in rural Victoria. Some music of the late 1960s and early 1970s was deliberately targeted at teenagers with simple catchy lyrics and tunes that could be danced to. It was referred to as bubblegum music. The most popular group being Ohio Express and the Archies with Sugar Sugar. The US group, the Monkees, became very popular during this period, with a British lead singer and a similar sound to the Beatles. They were deliberately manufactured for mass consumption through television and perfected the art of appealing to the youth market. African American music through the Motown record label was having an influence on popular music, with a young Michael Jackson as the lead singer of his band of brothers, the Jackson 5. The development of more serious soft rock aimed at the older audiences saw groups such as the Eagles from the US and Australia's Little River Band enjoy considerable success. The global phenomenon of disco took off in Australia in the mid-70s by US artists such as KC and the Sunshine Band, and later the Village People. European performers Leo Sayer and ABBA were also popular, perhaps more so in Australia than any other part of the world. Australian-based performers also contributed to the disco movement, with artists such as John Paul Young and the Bee Gees, who achieved worldwide success with their contribution to the soundtrack of the hit film Saturday Night Fever in 1977. Disco was certainly different to the music that had come before it, and it was distinctively 1970s. However, the heavy rock of Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin and homegrown AC/DC took music in a new direction and added another dimension to the image of the 1970s popular culture. Glam rock stars in Britain, with performers such as David Bowie and Gary Glitter and Roxy Music, who dressed in elaborate costumes, wore makeup and platform shoot. Australian group the Skyhooks combined the look of glam rock with controversial lyrics that saw much of their music banned in parts of Australia. Glam rock was very popular in Australia, with Split Enz and Sherbet also proving to be successful local talent. Perhaps the most confronting music to develop during the 1970s was punk. It was rebellious, loud and very threatening to traditional society. Brought to the world from Britain by Sex Pistols, The Clash and the Ramones from the United States, punk artists were anti-mainstream popular culture, and their appearance had a do-it-yourself look that rejected consumerism. As such, it was only ever really popular as part of a subculture in Australia. The Saints were probably the most successful Australian punk band, but punk did influence many Australian musicians such as Nick Cave. It is fair to conclude that in an increasingly globalised world, the music of Britain and the United States of America have played a large role in shaping the popular culture of Australia post-World War II. This, along with the rise of the teenager, has shaped the freedom and diversity of society as we know it today.
I got you. That's all I want. I won't forget. That's a whole lot. I don't go out. Not now that you're in. Sometimes we shout, but that's no problem. I don't know why sometimes I get frightened. down easy.